Hello students. Today we're going to talk about the male and female reproductive system, chapter 28 in our book. So let's just go over some general features of the male reproductive system and then get into the physiology. Both the male and the female reproductive systems involve external and internal reproductive structures. In the male reproductive system, external reproductive structures include the penis with associated tissues that we'll talk about, and the testicle with various tubes involved in sperm production and delivery. And the internal structures involve various tubes for the movement of semen and sperm, and several types of glands that we'll talk about in a minute. The testicle itself is involved in the production of sperm cells, as well as the production of hormones like testosterone. And so here we see a sagittal view of the testicle, and you can see from the picture that it's made up of several different types of little tubes. The tubes in these little lobules are referred to as seminiferous tubules, and those are the tubes where sperm cells will be made, and I'll cover that shortly. But once the sperm cells are made, they travel through a straight tubule into what's called the rete testes, and tubes leading from the rete testes, called efferent ducts, deliver the sperm cells into the tube that is part of the epididymis. So the epididymis is this structure right here that lies on the outside portion of the testicle and is made up of tubes that get really big, and the largest tube that leaves the epididymis is called the ductus vas deferens, which we also just call the vas deferens, and it carries the sperm cells after they're matured in the epididymis up the vas deferens, the ductus vas deferens, into what's called a spermatic cord, and then into the body. So we'll talk about the pathway that sperm take also in a second. The process by which sperm cells are made is called spermatogenesis. Spermatogenesis is the process of meiosis that we learned about a long time ago in general biology that takes place in the testicle, specifically cells called spermatogonium cells, spermatogonia plural, that lie in special cells around the seminiferous tubule. So these cells are the cells that undergo meiosis, that are involved in the production of sperm cells. So the cells migrate from the perimeter of the tube through to the middle of the tube called the lumen, and as these cells migrate from the perimeter to the lumen, they undergo meiosis 1 and then undergo meiosis 2 and produce the sperm cells. And we'll look at that a little bit more closely. So we have a link that you can review for the process of spermatogenesis. But in general, the spermatogonium cell, which is a diploid cell, contains 46 chromosomes, will develop into what's called a primary spermatocyte. The primary spermatocyte is the cell that undergoes meiosis 1, and at the end of meiosis 1, it divides into two haploid cells called secondary spermatocytes. The secondary spermatocytes then complete meiosis 2 to divide each into two more cells for a total of 4 immature sperm cells called spermatids. So haploid gametes, like the secondary spermatocytes and then ultimately the spermatids or haploid, they only have 23 chromosomes. So here's a flow chart for spermatogenesis. This represents the seminiferous tubule right here, and the cells that ultimately undergo spermatogenesis to produce the immature sperm cells that then called spermatozoa or spermatids that develop into what we know of as the mature sperm. So the process occurs starting with the spermatogonium cell. Now this spermatogonium cell is diploid. That's what 2N means. It means there's two sets of each chromosome of the 23 chromosomes inside the cell, and so it has 46 chromosomes. 23 of those came from the person's mother and 23 came from the person's father. The spermatogonium cells have the ability to undergo mitosis, which means they can clone themselves. So a male never runs out of the cells that have the potential to produce sperm cells. So some of those spermatogonium cells develop and differentiate into what's called a primary spermatocyte. The primary spermatocyte is diploid. It will undergo meiosis 1. We're not going to go back over all the phases of that, but if you remember prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase that we learned a long time ago, it occurs in mitosis and meiosis. Those phases occur, and at the end of telophase 1, the primary spermatocytes divide in half to produce 2 secondary spermatocytes, which are haploid, and that's why there's just N number of chromosomes. So these secondary spermatocytes have 23 chromosomes each. The secondary spermatocytes then undergo meiosis 2, ultimately to divide each into 2 cells for a total of 4, which are what we call the immature sperm cells, which have a couple of names, spermatids or spermatozoa. The spermatozoa is technically used for the cell that acquires a flagellum and the head piece region and mid piece region that we call a sperm cell. The sperm cell is the only flagellated cell in the human body. So this is the process of spermatogenesis. It occurs in the seminiferous tubule, and it involves meiosis, which there are 2 division events. Meiosis 1, producing secondary spermatocytes, and meiosis 2, producing immature sperm cells called spermatids. And they're held in place in the seminiferous tubule until they grow their tail and are able to swim, at which time they dislodge and go and swim down the length of the seminiferous tubule, down into the straight tubule, the rete testes, the efferent ducts, and then into the epididymis. So sperm cells ultimately are designed in order to do really 2 things. 1, penetrate the secondary oocyte. So there's layers on the oocyte that have to be penetrated, and once these layers are penetrated, it allows the sperm cell's nucleus to fuse with the egg cell's nucleus, in which case we call that fertilization, and the combination of the sperm cell with the egg cell forms what we call a zygote. Now, we'll talk about the eggs in a minute, but the egg cell and the sperm cell are haploid. They each have 23 chromosomes, so that when the sperm cell and the egg cell join together, it forms this zygote, which is diploid. So it contains 23 chromosomes from the egg, which comes from the mom, and then 23 from the sperm cell, which comes from the dad. So there's a neck region which contains centrioles on the sperm that produces microtubules to help form that flagellal tail that will allow the sperm cell to swim. There's a mid-piece region with multiple mitochondria which are involved in the production of ATP. So the ATP is the energy input so the sperm can swim, or what we call locomotion, allows the sperm to swim and then exit the male body and get into the female body to ultimately find the egg cell that we'll talk about where fertilization occurs when we get to the female reproductive system. So here's a picture of the sperm. You're not going to have to identify the structures on the lecture test, but nonetheless I wanted to show you the head of the sperm contains the nucleus where the 23 chromosomes are located, but there's also something called the acrosome. The acrosome is the tip of the head of the sperm, which contains enzymes that will allow the sperm cell to bore a hole through the layers of the egg so that the nucleus of the sperm can then unite with the nucleus of the egg cell. There's a neck region and then a midpiece region. The midpiece region is where all those mitochondria are located, and then the flagellum, or what we call the tail, which allows for the sperm to swim. Now, as far as the physiology of the male reproductive system is concerned, we're going to have to know about several hormones. We covered some of these in the endocrine chapter a while back. But nonetheless, we'll talk about them here as it relates to the reproductive system. So at puberty, the hypothalamus releases gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which is the hormone that stimulates the gonadotrophs in the anterior pituitary gland to produce the gonadotropins, which are the sex hormones, luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. They're called gonadotropins because they affect the gonads. Now, luteinizing hormone's role in the body is to help stimulate the testes, specifically the interstitial cells of Leydig or the interstitial endocrinocytes. Luteinizing hormone causes those cells to produce testosterone. So LH makes the testes produce testosterone, whereas follicle stimulating hormone causes the process of spermatogenesis to proceed in the seminiferous tubules. So here's a flow chart for the axis of the hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, and the testicle. The hypothalamus will release gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which stimulates the gonadotrophs in the anterior pituitary gland to release follicle-stimulating hormone and then luteinizing hormone. Follicle-stimulating hormone, again, is the hormone that stimulates the spermatogonium cells to undergo meiosis, to produce the primary spermatocyte, then the secondary spermatocyte that ultimately divides after meiosis 2 is completed into 4 spermatids, which become the sperm cells. Luteinizing hormone stimulates the interstitial endocrinocytes, which lie on the outside of the seminiferous tubule, to produce testosterone. Now, in the presence of both follicle-stimulating hormone and testosterone, these two hormones help increase the rate of spermatogenesis. So collectively together, follicle-stimulating hormone and testosterone increases basically sperm production. Now, testosterone and a metabolite called dihydrotestosterone ultimately cause the prenatal development of the male reproductive system in the baby growing in utero. Testosterone is involved in causing for the secondary sexual male characteristics to emerge at puberty. We all know that males have deeper voices, denser muscle mass, denser bone, increased bone density, variations in hair distribution patterns, all of the things that make a male different from a female, which happen at puberty, occur because of these male hormones. The testosterone also helps increase sexual function in the male, and it is a anabolic steroid, which basically means testosterone is involved in causing protein production in the body. And it's due to testosterone as to the reason why typically sized males have more muscle mass and bone density than the typical average sized female. So there's a negative feedback loop from the testes and the production of testosterone to the hypothalamus and the pituitary, where if we have an increase in blood levels of testosterone, so let's say there's a lot of testosterone in the blood, an increased level of testosterone then inhibits the hypothalamic anterior pituitary axis. So high levels of testosterone cause a decrease in gonadotropin releasing hormone, and if we have a decrease in gonadotropin releasing hormone, it decreases the production of luteinizing hormone by the gonadotrophs in the anterior pituitary gland, which causes them to decrease their testosterone production. And when testosterone levels start to decline, this negative feedback loop is shut off, and we get gonadotropin releasing hormone out, which stimulates luteinizing hormone production, which stimulates the interstitial cells to make more testosterone. So basically, if there is testosterone in the blood, we can stop making it. If there's not enough testosterone in the blood, we need to actually turn on all these hormones to cause the interstitial endocrinocytes to make testosterone. Now, as far as the sperm cells are concerned, again, let's reiterate, sperm cells and fluid travel through the seminiferous tubules, through the straight tubules, and then into the rete testes. From the rete testes, the sperm and fluids are flowing through what we call efferent ducts, which carry the sperm cells into the epididymis. Sperm cells are held in the epididymis until they mature, basically until they have the ability to fertilize an egg. The epididymis then propels the sperm out via the vas deferens, which ultimately carries the sperm back into the body. The vas deferens exits the epididymis at the tail of the epididymis and enters the spermatic cord. The spermatic cord carries the vas deferens up into the pelvis, where it then courses over the ureters and passes down the side, posterior lateral sides of the urinary bladder. And so let's take a look at the picture of what's going on. So here is the vas deferens. It's coming in. This comes up through the spermatic cord and then enters the body. It courses over the ureter. This comes from the kidney, which carries urine down to the urinary bladder. So that vas deferens then opens up to an area called an ampulla. That's an enlarged area. And the sperm cells travel through the ampulla, and the ampulla is joined by a duct from the largest of the paired glands in the male reproductive system. These glands are called the seminal vesicles. They lie on the posterior side of the bladder, and they secrete their seminal fluids into this duct. It's called the ejaculatory duct, as sperm cells are passing from the ampulla of the vas deferens. So the seminal fluid comes from the seminal vesicles. The sperm cells are coming down the vas deferens through the ampulla and enter this part of the urethra. Now this gland right here, and we'll talk about these glands in a minute, is called the prostate gland. It's not a paired gland, it's a single gland, and it encircles the urethra. So the prostate gland also produces fluids important in the viability of sperm cells, and so the prostate will secrete fluid into its secretions into what's called the prostatic urethra. That's the part of the urethra that goes through the prostate gland. So the seminal fluids come from the seminal vesicles. The sperm cells are coming down through the vas deferens and the ampulla of the vas deferens, and all of that is being ejected into the prostatic urethra through what's called the ejaculatory ducts. So the seminal fluids, the prostatic fluids, and the sperm cells are traveling through the prostatic urethra, then through a part of the urethra that's called the membranous urethra. Just on either side of the membranous urethra are a pair of glands called the bulbourethral glands or Cowper's glands. They actually secrete their viscous mucoid alkaline secretions into the urethra just prior to ejaculation, and we'll talk about all of these secretions in a minute. But the urethra in the male is used in both the urinary system, because urine can leave the urinary bladder and go down through the urethra, as well as the urethra is involved in a reproductive system for the delivery of the seminal fluids, prostatic fluid, and sperm cells down through the urethra and ultimately out of the body. So the ejaculatory ducts again arise from the junction of the duct of the seminal vesicle and the ampulla of the vas deferens. The urethra is a duct that is going to be involved in both reproductive and urinary system function. And semen, which basically is a collection of secretions from the seminal vesicles and a prostate gland, as well as sperm cells, can pass through the urethra as well as urine. So in this picture, we can see up here at the top the urinary bladder. Here's the prostate gland. It encircles a portion of the urethra as it leaves the urinary bladder. That's called the prostatic urethra. This part is called the membranous urethra. These are the paired bulbal urethral glands called Cowper's glands. And then the rest of the urethra that travels through the penis itself is called the spongy urethra. Now, we have to talk about the tissues involved in causing the erection of the penis, which includes 3 erectile tissues, 2 dorsal bands of tissue called the corpora cavernosa, which we see here, and then something called the spongy corpus spongiosum, which is the erectile tissue that surrounds the urethra directly and forms the gland's penis or the head of the penis. Now let's talk about the glands a little bit more. The seminal vesicles are the largest of the male reproductive glands. They are paired. They lie on the posterior part of the urinary bladder. They secrete an alkaline fluid that contains fructose, compounds called prostaglandins, and clotting proteins. The prostate gland is a single gland. It's shaped like a donut, and it surrounds the urethra. It produces a milky, slightly acidic fluid that contains citric acid, some enzymes that can lyse proteins called proteolytic enzymes, acid phosphatase, and some enzyme called seminal plasmin. The bulbourethral glands produce an alkaline mucus fluid that helps lubricate the urethra and neutralizes the acid in the urethra, which the secretion from the bulbourethral gland basically prepares the urethra for sperm cells to be transported out of the penis during ejaculation. So the secretion from the bulbourethral glands actually begins just prior to ejaculation, and it lubricates the urethra so the sperm cells aren't damaged when they're propelled through it, and it raises the pH back up, because the last thing that came through the urethra besides sperm coming out is urine, and urine is acidic, and that acid environment can damage the sperm cells. Now, semen itself is more than just sperm. It's a collection of the secretions from the glands, seminal vesicles, and the prostate gland. The average volume of an ejaculate ranges from about 2.5 to 5 milliliters, and you can have upwards to 150 million sperm per mil. The pH of the ejaculate is 7.2 to 7.7. Which is viable, allows for the viability of the sperm cells. The penis itself has 3 erectile tissues. We need to know what they are. There are 2 corpora cavernosal tissue bands on the dorsal side of the penis, and then only 1 corpus spongiosum. The head of the penis is referred to as the glans penis, or just the glands. So let me go back to this picture. These are the erectile tissues. There's 2 bands on the top of the penis, and then the corpus spongiosum encircles the urethra, so there's only 1 of those. These erectile tissues engorge with blood in order to cause an erection of the penis to allow sexual intercourse to occur. Here's a cross-section of the penis. You can see the erectile tissues a little bit more. You see these vascular sinuses in here. These are the bands of the corpora cavernosa. This is the band of the corpus spongiosum with the urethra in the middle, and here's a drawing of it. Now, we're not identifying these, but you still need to know the names of the erectile tissues that are in the penis that engorge with blood to cause erection. So let's talk about how the autonomic nervous system is involved with sexual function in the male. First of all, the erection itself of the penis is caused by a parasympathetic reflex. So the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system is responsible for causing the erection of the penis because it induces vasodilation of arteries, or small arteries, arterioles, in the erectile tissue, which causes the erectile tissues to gain large amounts of blood. And as the blood enters these sinuses it compresses the veins, which prevents the blood from leaving, and basically the blood gets trapped in the erectile tissue for a certain period of time. Now, the process of ejaculation, or the propulsion of semen out of the male reproductive system, out of the penis, is a sympathetic reflex. So the sympathetic nervous system is involved in ejaculation, and the parasympathetic nervous system is involved in the erection. So here's a little flow chart that shows the pathway of information flow for the parasympathetic nervous system. So there's different types of stimulation. Erotic sights, smells, and sounds can enter the brain, which can help stimulate this parasympathetic reflex, which causes the dilation of the arterioles so that the erectile tissues engorge with blood and then cause the erection. And obviously mechanical stimulation of the penis itself stimulates the parasympathetic reflex to cause this vasodilation to occur. Now, the erectile dysfunction drug called Viagra, which has many names now, or sildenafil, the generic, is a drug that causes these arterioles to dilate. Without the inputs from the brain and or mechanical stimulation directly from the penis, those drugs can dilate these arterioles to cause the erection of the penis. So here's a animation describing the hormonal function of the male reproductive system. I suggest you look at that. It'll help you out. So we have to move into the female reproductive system. The female reproductive system, like the male reproductive system, have some external structures as well as internal structures. Externally, the vulva, which are called the labia, the labial folds. We have a labia majora and a labia minora. Here they show the urinary bladder and the urethra, which is not part of the female reproductive system. The female urethra is only involved in the female, only involved in the urinary system. The clitoris itself is analogous to the glans penis on the penis, or the head of the penis. The vaginal canal is the entryway for sperm cells to gain access to the internal structures of the female reproductive tract, as well as a pathway for the delivery of the baby when a female is giving birth. So we have the vaginal canal. We then see the uterus up here, where the implantation of a fertilized egg will occur for the development of the baby. There's a fallopian tube, which is also called the uterine tube, and then a pair of ovaries. Here we just see one. The ovaries themselves are analogous to the testes. The ovaries are involved in the production of the female gametes, which are called, everybody calls the eggs. They're called ova. So that's what this is. The ova is plural, ovum would be singular. So the ovaries are involved in egg development, or the development of the ova, as well as the production of the female hormones that we covered some time back, at least a couple of these in passing. The progesterone and the estrogens, inhibin and relaxin. And we're going to look at these hormone interactions for the female reproductive cycle. Inside the ovary, there are fluid-filled structures where the eggs will develop. Those are called the ovarian follicles. The follicles contain oocytes in different stages of development. Those oocytes are surrounded by follicular cells forming the wall of a follicle, and then special cells called granulosal cells, which at a certain part of the female reproductive cycle, these cells produce some of the hormones. Now, a mature follicle that contains the cell that will be ovulated, which everybody says the egg, is called a mature follicle, or a Graafian follicle. So a Graafian follicle contains the secondary oocyte, which is not a mature egg yet. It hasn't completed meiosis 2, but this is the egg cell, so to speak, that will be ovulated around the 14th day of a regular 28-day cycle. As this follicle ruptures, it will release a secondary oocyte. This follicle that ruptures open to release a secondary oocyte then develops into a gland called the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is the hormone-producing structure post-ovulatory. So after ovulation occurs, the progesterones and estrogens, inhibin and relaxin come from the corpus luteum. So here they show a picture of the ovary. Here's the uterus, the ovarian ligaments holding the ovaries in place. And then this is the uterine tube or the fallopian tube. And you can see that the fallopian tube does not directly attach to the ovary. And at the very end of the fallopian tube are these little finger-like projections right here that ultimately help sweep the ovulated secondary oocyte up into the hollow uterine tube. So let's look at generically the development of these follicles. So a female baby is born with all of the primordial follicles that she'll ever have. So the female ovary has a limited number of eggs that can be developed over the course of the reproductive years of the female. Unlike males, who can produce gametes or sperm throughout his life, females only have a predisposed number of egg cells that can develop over a number of reproductive years. And then after the reproductive years are over, which happens at what we call menopause, then the ovary stops making the hormones and stops making egg cells. So these primordial follicles develop into what's called a primary follicle. Meiosis will occur inside this follicle, and meiosis 1 will be completed so that in a mature Graafian follicle there is a secondary oocyte. So the primary oocyte develops into a secondary oocyte, which is the cell that will be ovulated. So once a month, around the 14th day of a regular 28-day cycle, when this mature Graafian follicle fuses with the surface of the ovary, it ruptures open and releases the secondary oocyte. That's called ovulation. This ruptured follicle then forms a blood clot in it because there's a little wound here. This structure is called the corpus hemorrhagicum. Because of the blood clot, it heals up, and the cells of the follicle enlarge and become what's called the corpus luteum. So the corpus luteum is the structure in the ovary that produces the reproductive hormones after ovulation occurs. So that's always referred to as post-ovulatory. The follicles themselves, the cells around them, produce estrogens and progesterones, inhibin and relaxin before ovulation. So that's called pre-ovulatory. After the follicle ruptures open to cause ovulation to occur, the corpus luteum will develop, and it produces the sexual hormones after ovulation or post-ovulatory. So let's talk about the formation of the egg cells or the female gametes. That process is called oogenesis. The process of sperm production in a male is called spermatogenesis. In the female is called oogenesis. So oogenesis basically is the meiotic process that occurs in follicles within the ovary. And the oogonium cells, or oogonia plural, are diploid, and they will develop into a primary oocyte, which is also diploid. The primary oocyte is the cell that will develop into the secondary oocyte that will be ovulated on the 14th day of a regular 28-day cycle. So the female reproductive cycle involves various hormones, and the cycle begins at puberty. So around the time of puberty and once a month thereafter, there is a cyclical increase and decrease in several hormones, which include follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So follicle stimulating hormone, as the name implies, stimulates the follicle to develop. So follicle stimulating hormone basically causes for the development of the primordial follicles. Some of those primordial follicles begin to grow and they develop into a primary follicle until that follicle reaches maturity. So while the mature follicle, within the mature follicle, the primary oocyte completes meiosis 1, which is a diploid cell, contains 46 chromosomes. But at the end of meiosis 1, it produces a haploid secondary oocyte, and which is the largest of the cells, and a smaller cell which is called a polar body. And the first one to develop is called the first polar body. So that one primary oocyte divides at the end of meiosis 1 into a secondary oocyte and a small cell called the first polar body. The first polar body is so small that it's not viable. It will be reabsorbed by the body. The secondary oocyte is the cell that will be ovulated. So at ovulation, there are groups of cells that surround the secondary oocyte. Those cells become part of what's called the corona radiata. And in the middle of that is the secondary oocyte. So that is what is ovulated and will enter the uterine tube. If sperm cells are present in the female reproductive tract, the sperm cells will swim up into the uterus, and 50% of them go up the right uterine tube and 50% go up the left uterine tube. And only one of those uterine tubes typically will have a secondary oocyte coming down the tube. But fertilization typically takes place in the fallopian tube. Now, if sperm cells are present and sperm cells begin to try and fertilize that egg, then the secondary oocyte will complete meiosis 2 to form a mature ovum and a second polar body. The mature ovum is the actual egg cell that can be fertilized. The second polar body is small and won't be fertilized. And when the sperm cell unites with the ovum, its nucleus unites with the egg cell itself, it becomes a diploid zygote, and the zygote is what develops into another person, into the little baby. So here's an animation of fertilization. You should look at that. And here's a little schematic for the meiotic process in the ovary for the female. So let me just go over this with you and tell you a couple of differences here from males to females. So the oogonium cells are diploid. They have a full set of mom's genes and chromosomes and a full set of dad's chromosomes. And so those oogonium cells will develop in a primordial follicle into what we call a primary oocyte, which is still diploid. The primary oocyte will then undergo meiosis 1, which is the first division event, and produce 2 cells of unequal size because of what we call unequal equatorial division. The secondary oocyte is the largest of the cells and is the cell that is viable. The first polar body is a smaller cell that will not develop into a viable egg cell. If sperm cells are present, then the secondary oocyte can complete meiosis 2, which will then develop and divide into the mature egg called the ovum and a second polar body. And this second polar body again is not viable. And the ovum will receive the nucleus from the sperm cell, which is haploid, and fuse with the haploid nucleus of the egg cell to reinstate the diploid condition, which this one single cell, a fertilized egg called a zygote, then has the capability of dividing and producing all of the cells that make up a new human being, a baby, which is kind of amazing. Everything that makes up us comes from this one cell right here. All right, the female reproductive tract contains 2 uterine tubes. Each of them is associated with an ovary, so there's a pair of ovaries. The ovaries are not directly connected to the uterine tubes. The tubes basically is the pathway for sperm to come up to reach the ovum and for the secondary oocyte to be fertilized in the uterine tube. After fertilization occurs in a tube, it takes about 5 days for that zygote, the fertilized egg, the zygote, to reach the uterus, and implantation will occur thereafter, and the baby will start to develop. The uterine tubes have 3 basic layers to them. There is a mucosal layer, which is lined by a simple ciliated columnar epithelium. There's a muscularis layer, some smooth muscle down the length of that tube, and then the serosa, connective tissue along the outside of the tube. The ciliated columnar cells create a current. The cilia beat to create a current that causes fluid, peritoneal fluid, to move down the tube, which carries the oocyte down the tube towards the uterus. Interspersed in that simple ciliated columnar epithelium are specialized cells called PEG cells, and the PEG cells secrete a fluid that provides nourishment for the ovum as it comes down the fallopian tube. The uterus is the pathway for both sperm that is deposited in the vagina to reach the uterine tubes, and is the area where implantation of the zygote will occur. The uterus is divided into a superior or top portion called the fundus. The broad part of the uterus is called the body. There's an inferior extension towards the vagina at the end of the vagina that's called the cervix, which is the tip of the uterus. And in between the body of the uterus and the cervix is an area called the isthmus. The uterus is obviously where the fertilized egg or ovum will implant for the development of the baby. Now, histologically, there are three basic layers of the uterus. We're not going to identify the layers, just know a little bit about what I put here. There's something called the perimetrium. That's basically the connective tissue or serosa that surrounds the outer part of the uterus. The thickest part of the uterus is where the smooth muscle layers are located. That's called the myometrium in the middle. And then the endometrium is the inner layer of the uterus, which is made up of the stratum functionalis, which is an extension and sheddable layer from what's called the stratum basilis. So once a month, the stratum functionalis is built up, or it grows, and if the female is not pregnant, that stratum functionalis dies and is shed from the uterus out the vagina as the menstrual flow. The stratum basilis is the layer that's permanent in the inside of the uterus and constantly gives rise to a new stratum functionalis once a month after puberty in a female that is not pregnant. So the stratum functionalis is what changes during the uterine cycle of the female reproductive cycle through the reproductive years of the female. So the female reproductive system internal structures include the uterus. The fallopian tubes, you can see, are attached to the uterus, not the ovaries. The top part of the uterus is called the fundus. The body is the broad part, and the cervix is down here, the tip, at the extension of the vaginal canal. The thickest layer of the uterus is the myometrium in the middle. That's the muscle bands. And then the inner layer is called the endometrium. There are several glands that I want us to know about that are part of normal female reproductive function. There are a pair of glands called the paraurethral glands, or what's called the Skene's glands. These glands are homologous to the prostate gland in the male. They help produce mucus during sexual intercourse and helps lubricate the vaginal canal. The greater vestibular glands, or Bartholin's glands as they're called, also produce mucus during sexual arousal and form lubrication for sexual intercourse to occur. The greater vestibular glands are analogous to the bulbourethral glands in the male. Remember, the bulbourethral glands in the male secrete a mucoid alkaline secretion to help lubricate the urethra. Well, these glands help lubricate a portion of the vaginal canal to allow intercourse to occur. There's also the bulb of the vestibule. The bulb of the vestibule is erectile tissue that engorges with blood during sexual arousal, and it helps narrow the orifice of the vaginal canal, which applies pressure to the penis during sexual intercourse. It also, as the vestibule engorges with blood, compresses the opening of the urethra so that urine can't flow during sexual intercourse. Now, in a non-pregnant female, there are cyclical changes which occur both in the ovaries and in the uterus. That's part of what we call the female reproductive cycle. The cycle for the ovary involves oogenesis and the production of the ovum and the preparation of the uterus occurs in what we call the uterine cycle for the implantation of the fertilized egg. So the ovarian cycle deals with the changes of the ovary for the production of the oocytes, and the uterine cycle deals with the development of the endometrium, specifically the stratum functionalis, to prepare it for implantation and development of an embryo. Now this is a graphic just showing the relationship of the various hormones from the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary axis to the ovaries. Right here represents the follicles that will develop and where the hormones are coming from for the different parts of the female reproductive cycle. So the hypothalamus produces gonadotropin releasing hormone, which stimulates the gonadotrophs to release FSH and LH. FSH induces the development of the follicles. The follicles themselves and the cells around the follicle, before ovulation occurs, is where the estrogens and inhibin comes from. After ovulation, that ruptured follicle then develops into the corpus luteum due to luteinizing hormone. So luteinizing hormone causes really two main things to occur. It causes the actual ovulation of the secondary oocyte, and it stimulates the ruptured follicle to develop into the corpus luteum, which is the hormone producing structure post-ovulatory. So that's where all of the estrogens and progesterones and whatnot come from after ovulation, comes from the corpus luteum. The reproductive cycle itself contains 4 basic phases: menstrual phase or menstruation, the pre-ovulatory phase, which all the changes which occur before ovulation. Then we have ovulation of the secondary oocyte, and then all the changes which occur after ovulation is called post-ovulatory phase. The phases range anywhere from 24 to 36 days. However, the changes which we're about to look at basically is going to show a 28-day cycle. So here's a graphic that represents the changes which occur over the course of 28 days, down here at the bottom, the days, with respect to what's going on with the ovaries, the follicles in the ovaries up here at the top for the ovarian cycle, and what happens to the endometrium for the uterine cycle over the course of these days. So the cycle is separated into the menstrual phase, which is the first few days of the cycle, the pre-ovulatory phase, which extends from the menstrual phase up to about day 14. Day 14 then is where we get what's called the LH spike, which I'll talk about in a second, and it causes ovulation to occur. And after that, for the rest of the female reproductive cycle in that month, that's called the post-ovulatory phase. So these are the generic phases, but we have different names for those areas of the month for the ovaries and for the uterus. So let's look at the ovaries first. In the pre-ovulatory phase of the ovarian cycle, it's called the follicular phase. The follicular phase is the phase during which the follicles will develop in the ovary and thus produce the estrogens pre-ovulatory. That's where the estrogens come from. Then you have ovulation, which is just called ovulation. The secondary oocyte is ovulated out. And after ovulation, we have what's called the luteal phase for the ovarian cycle. The luteal phase is the phase during the development of the ruptured Graafian follicle to develop into the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum is the hormone producing structure in the ovary post-ovulatory. So after ovulation, this is where the hormones come from. So let's talk about these hormones for a minute. As it turns out, these hormones increase and decrease over the course of the reproductive cycle during the month. And depending on if the hormones are high or low, it will cause positive and negative feedback, a positive and a negative inhibitory loops to occur to regulate these reproductive hormones. So for instance, pre-ovulatory, the follicles will produce estrogen. So estrogen starts to rise. just before these follicles started to develop, follicle-stimulating hormone was released to cause the follicle to develop. And that's why this is called follicle-stimulating hormone. So even just prior to the beginning of a new cycle, follicle-stimulating hormone is on the rise, and it stimulates follicles to grow. As these follicles begin to grow, more and more estrogen will be released. When estrogen levels are high, it causes for a large amount of gonadotropin-releasing hormone to be released. So we get more FSH out, but we get a lot of luteinizing hormone out. So as estrogen rises, it causes for more luteinizing hormone to be released, and that occurs about 24 hours before ovulation occurs, and that's called the LH spike or the LH surge. And the LH spike is what causes the Graafian follicle to rupture open, releasing the secondary oocyte. After ovulation, luteinizing hormone's role is to cause the ruptured follicle to develop into the corpus luteum. Now, the corpus luteum is only viable for about 2 weeks. So about 2 weeks after ovulation, the corpus luteum will be viable and producing hormones, estrogens and progesterone. Progesterone and estrogens are required in order for the stratum functionalis to be maintained for the growth and the maintenance of that stratum functionalis. Specifically, progesterone helps increase blood flow to the stratum functionalis. So if a female is not pregnant, at the end of those 2 weeks or so, the corpus luteum is going to die, and it develops into the corpus albicans. The reason for that is because over the course of these 2 weeks, luteinizing hormone starts to decline. And when luteinizing hormone declines, it causes the corpus luteal cells to die, and it becomes scar tissue in the ovary, and that's what the corpus albicans is. So when the corpus luteum stops producing progesterones and estrogens, the arterial supply to the stratum functionalis here dies, and which then all the cells of the stratum functionalis die, and they become the menstrual flow for the next cycle. Now, in a female that is pregnant, the corpus luteum is still only going to be viable for a certain period of time, but if the female is pregnant, there is a hormone released called human chorionic gonadotropic hormone. That hormone is the hormone tested on the home pregnancy test. And that hormone's role is to maintain the viability of the corpus luteum for about another week or so, beyond what it normally would be viable for to produce progesterone and estrogens. So that's the amount of time it would take for the fertilized egg to implant on the uterus, and thus the cells that become the placental cells then take over the job of producing progesterone and estrogens during the length of the pregnancy. If progesterone drops, the stratum functionalis will shed and become a menses flow. All right, excuse me, sorry. Now, this chart just shows over the course of the reproductive month the levels of the hormones. So you can see at the beginning, follicle-stimulating hormone is high. So this is during the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle, stimulates the follicles to grow. As the follicles begin to grow, you can see the estrogen levels start to go up. And as the estrogen levels start to go up, because the follicles are growing and producing more estrogen, when estrogen levels get high, it stimulates for the release of more luteinizing hormone from the gonadotrophs in the anterior pituitary gland. And about a day or so before ovulation occurs, around that 14th day, we get what is called the LH spike or the LH surge. So within 24 hours of that LH surge, then ovulation will occur. So ovulation is occurring right around day 14. Once ovulation occurs, the mature follicle that ruptured to release the secondary oocyte then develops into the corpus luteum. There's no more follicles developing to produce estrogen, so the corpus luteum develops, and the corpus luteum then causes for more progesterone to be made, So this is during what's called the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle, and progesterone and estrogen are being made by the corpus luteum. Notice how estrogen falls off for a little bit. That's because the follicle stops making estrogen until the corpus luteum develops during this luteal phase. Then progesterone and estrogen will be produced, and if the female is not pregnant, the corpus luteum is going to die and become scar tissue called the corpus albicans, and in which case progesterone falls, estrogen falls, and when progesterone declines, the stratum functionalis of the endometrium then dies and becomes the menses of the next cycle. So there's a feedback from all of these various hormones. You should look at the animations of the female reproductive cycle so that you can get a better understanding of the interactions of all of these hormones that are involved in regulating the female reproductive cycle. So here's just a little graphic demonstrating how luteinizing hormone is going to be stimulated to be increased, which causes the LH surge, and it causes ovulation to occur. So this is the ovary down here. This is the mature follicle containing the secondary oocyte. And the estrogen feedback to the hypothalamus causes gonadotropin-releasing hormone to be released, which stimulates the gonadotropes to release luteinizing hormone, which stimulates the fusion of the Graafian follicle to the surface of the ovary. So once a month, there's a little wound at the surface of the ovary where the secondary oocyte will be ovulated. Now this ruptured follicle then becomes what's called the corpus hemorrhagicum, because there's a little wound and there's going to be some blood clot formation there. And then luteinizing hormone's role after ovulation is to get all of these cells of the ruptured follicle, first of all, it heals up, and then they get big and to produce hormones, and it's called the corpus luteum. Sorry. So here's a flow chart for the interaction of the hormones. The green lines show a positive feedback for the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland axis, and the red line is inhibitory. So you can see that gonadotropin-releasing hormone is going to cause the release of FSH and LH from the gonadotropes, and then all of the roles that they perform that we covered. Follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates follicular growth. Luteinizing hormone stimulates ovulation and the development of the corpus luteum. Pre-ovulatory, the hormones come from the follicles. Post-ovulatory, the hormones come from the corpus luteum. And you can then read in the box up here as to how the hormones are either stimulating or inhibiting the hypothalamic anterior pituitary axis. So just review this chart. If you have any questions on that, just email me and I'll answer them. But there's really good animations dealing with the female reproductive cycle in the packet. So just make sure you go over the phases of the female reproductive cycle. And again, if you have any questions, just let me know and I will get back to you. All right, thank you for watching the video. Until next time, signing off, Tom Russell.